In the annals of American presidential history, President Herbert Hoover hasn't been much loved. Elected in the Roaring '20s, he took office just months before the Wall Street crash of 1929, and he's been defined by the Great Depression ever since. That makes for an incomplete picture of the 31st President of the United States, one that a new biography goes a long way to rectifying. It's called Hoover, An Extraordinary Life in Extraordinary Times, and it's written by Kenneth Whyte, former editor-in-chief at Maclean's and a past president of Rogers Publishing. Ken Whyte joins us now for more. Good to have you in that chair.
Great to be here.
I really love the book. I got to tell you, what a great piece of work on your behalf. But I got a bunch of fast questions off the top that you got to help me with. Okay, so here we go. Humor me here. Are you from Iowa?
No, I've been there, though.
Yeah, I know you've been there a dozen times to write the book, but you're not from there. Were you orphaned at the age of 9?
I was not.
God forbid?
No.
Did you go to Stanford University?
No, I didn't. I visited the campus.
Did you cover the '28 election?
I wasn't there.
Not that old. Do you have a great history with the mining industry in the United States?
Never been in a mine.
Okay. Okay, so you see where I'm going here. You appear to have absolutely nothing in common with this guy or his story. So why 600 pages on Herbert Hoover?
I asked myself that question when it was first suggested to me. I wasn't really interested in Hoover. I just had the same impression everyone did of him as a failed president. But I had been reading a lot about the First World War, and Herbert Hoover keeps popping up everywhere you read about the First World War as this amazingly competent guy. And if you wanted to get anything done, say in Europe while they were negotiating the peace, you had to go through Herbert Hoover. He was this incredibly competent, riveting figure that was so at odds with the picture I had of him as president that I had to look a little closer and see what was really there.
Well, let's tell some of that story then, because everybody knows the story about the fact that he was the president during the Great Depression, and it completely marked, well, really the rest of his life in some respects. Mm-hmm. Here's what I learned in this book. This guy saved millions of lives in Belgium during World War I, people who might otherwise have starved to death. How did that happen?
Well, Hoover was in London at the outbreak of the war. He was a mining engineer. He had a global career. He was doing really well. But he was also looking for something new to do in his life, and he wanted to do public service in some sense. And this huge opportunity came at the outbreak of the war with Belgium, because the Germans, of course, rode over Belgium on their way to France. And suddenly the 8 million people in Belgium were left without food. They imported 85% of their food at the time, and with the Germans occupying them, the British with a blockade of their seaports, they suddenly had no food. So Hoover, at a time when all the ships in the world had been pulled into military service, and all the food and all the manpower had been pulled into military service, managed to enough ships, enough food around the world to almost single-handedly feed Belgium for 8 years, for the 5 years of the war. It was an incredible humanitarian feat.
Now, where was the? I mean, you do point out the man from a relatively early go had an ego and had some sense he was destined for something huge. Mm-hmm. But there is this incredible public service side to him that you would not think would emerge from a 9-year-old orphan in the middle of Iowa who obviously grew up in poverty and tragedy. Where does that come from?
Yes, and especially when you read on top of that about his career as a mining engineer, and he is a fairly ruthless operator and very concerned with his own welfare, not the welfare of his employees or anybody else.
He called himself the devil.
That's right. So he had a very self-interested side, a very ruthless side. But his parents were both in the Quaker community in which they were born, dedicated to the welfare of the community. His mother was a minister. His father sat on what passed for the town council. So Hoover had a good grounding in his early years in serving the community. And then when he went to Stanford at the time, they preached an ethic of service to the greater community. It wasn't about how much money you could make. It wasn't about what you could do for yourself. It was what you could do for the world. So there was influences all along that encouraged him to public service.
So to be a Quaker, he was the first Quaker president, right?
He was, yeah.
To be a Quaker back then meant values such as what?
Well, if you were a strict Quaker, you went to worship on Saturdays. You didn't smoke, you didn't drink, you didn't play cards, you didn't read fiction. You lived a fairly austere existence, and Hoover was raised in that environment. But by the time he was out on his own in his early 20s, he'd broken pretty much all of those rules and was living a fairly secular life.
I do want to, listen, maybe I got this wrong, but as I read the book, I thought to myself, this guy's what we would today call a progressive conservative. I mean, he's clearly got a fiscal, conservative side to him, but he's got a bleeding heart as well. Is that an okay conclusion to come to?
Oh, very much so. Yeah, yes. He was a progressive. He believed that you could use government and the influence of government to make the world a better place. He believed that every individual had a right to the basics of life, not just food, clothing, and shelter, but education and health care, and that was the way to make the most vibrant society you could. You give everybody a fair shot, a fair chance at the outset of life, and let them do their best, and you'd have the strongest possible society. So, he was progressive in that sense.
And yet, however, when he became president, and the Depression then happens almost immediately on his watch, the crash, and then 25% unemployment, and just, this appalling circumstances, he is pressured to bring the full might of the federal government to bear to help people out, and he doesn't. He won't. He certainly didn't do what Franklin Roosevelt came to do, and he certainly didn't do what Barack Obama led in the Great Recession of 2008. So is it fair to say that he really believed in a muscular role for the federal government in response to the tragedy of the time?
A couple of points. He did more from 28 to 32, way more than any administration had ever done before in a depression. He believed in counter-cyclical policies when the economy turned down, and so he employed more people in the federal government. He did public works projects and encouraged public works projects in all three levels of government. He intervened in agriculture in quite a substantial way, buying up crops. So he went a lot further than anyone had gone before. The one thing that he wouldn't do was direct federal aid to victims of the Depression. And that is what he has been pilloried for in the history books ever since. And I was prepared to pillory him along with everyone else, but when I actually got in there and started looking what was happening in that period, and particularly in 1931, 1932, when things got really bad, it was really surprising how much resistance there was across the country to the federal government stepping in and giving direct federal aid to victims of the Depression. The New York Times, for instance, did a poll in 1931 of all the mayors, 25 mayors of the biggest cities in America. And at the time, local governments and state governments were the ones who were responsible for the welfare of their citizens and for making sure that they had enough to eat. It was a local responsibility, not a federal responsibility. And the mayors, almost to a man, 23 out of 25, said, no way we want the federal government meddling in our business here in these cities. We can take care of our own. They were insulted at the notion that the federal government had to step in and bail them out. And thought that the federal government was overreaching its jurisdiction even by talking about it. Senate of the United States twice had opportunities to deliver direct federal aid to victims of the Depression and overwhelmingly voted it down because they believed it was a local responsibility. And I found a poll that was commissioned in 1932, right at the end of Hoover's term, that asked both Democrats and Republicans whether or not the federal government should give direct aid to the unemployed in the Depression. 86% of Democrats said no, and 90% of Republicans said no.
Then explain to me how Franklin Roosevelt wins a 60-40 election at the end of 1932.
Franklin Roosevelt was a genius of a politician, and he blamed the entire Depression on Herbert Hoover. He said Hoover's policies had started it. He said Hoover's policies had made it worse. He called it the Hoover Depression. There wasn't much behind that. The Depression was a global phenomenon, and it had already started really before Hoover even achieved office. But Roosevelt, being the brilliant politician that he was, made Hoover wear it, and Hoover wore it the rest of his life.
And was it Charlie Michelson who came up?
I should say as well that even though Roosevelt was president deeper into the Depression after 5, 6, 7 years of downturn, he was still very tentative about direct federal aid to victims of the Depression. He framed everything he was doing as temporary relief. He didn't want people on the dole in any permanent way. He didn't want the federal government to be in the position of permanently bailing out victims of the Depression. He kept saying this is an emergency situation, it's a short-term situation. So they weren't actually that far apart.
But you do point out the irony of the fact that if you look at the record, 3 years of Depression happened on Hoover's watch, 6 years of it happened on Roosevelt's watch, and Roosevelt is thought to be the man with the New Deal who, beat back the Depression.
Yes.
History's unfair sometimes, isn't it?
Yes, it is, and it's also written by the winners, and it was
Yes.
a lot of New Deal historians like Arthur Schlesinger Jr. who wrote in the 40s, 50s, the leading interpretations of what happened in that period.
And I'm trying to remember now, was it Charlie Michelson who came up with the name of Hoovervilles?
That's right.
These poor shanty towns that sprung up all over America. They named him after him. Even after he was out of office, they still named him Hoovervilles.
Even on Roosevelt's watch, they were still Hoovervilles, yeah. That's right.
Hoover, of course, attacked the New Deal, FDR's New Deal. He didn't like it. Those attacks and what Hoover stood for at the time, how much of that is the basis for modern conservatism today?
Hoover was actually conflicted on the New Deal. He couldn't decide whether he wanted to take credit for it or attack it originally. Because when Roosevelt came in, it was acknowledged by a lot of his people that much of what Roosevelt did was based on policies already enacted by Hoover. People like Rex Tugwell, who was one of Roosevelt's most prominent advisors, said that when we came into Washington, we thought we were going to set the world on fire, and we found that most of the things that we'd anticipated doing had already been anticipated by the previous government. And Hoover was conscious of that and a bit irked by that Roosevelt was getting credit for a lot of things that he did. But Roosevelt went further. Roosevelt intervened in the economy in ways that Hoover never would have done, with wage and price controls, intervening in industry and agriculture in much more radical ways than Hoover would have ever done. And at some point, I think it was around 1936, Hoover really got the sense that this was a different direction for government in America, and something that wasn't consistent with American values, traditions, institutions, and he became a leading opponent of the New Deal. And yes, in 1937 came out with a sort of a manifesto that said that more government wasn't the answer, that you couldn't spend your way to prosperity, and that
These sound like modern-day Republican
modern-day
principles.
Republicans. And yes, so if you look for the birth of the Republican movement, you have it really with Hoover's protests in 1937.
You say history is written by the...
Not the Republican movement, but the modern conservative movement.
You do say that history is written by the winners, and he tried to write his own history, but it didn't really go anywhere, did he? He wrote a few books, didn't he? Or at least
he wrote over 30 books, and I'd say about a dozen of them were ones that were designed to justify the ways of Hoover to man, and he wasn't very successful at all.
We should, I guess, point out for the record here, he was the oldest living ex-president ever, died at 90, until Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush came along. And he was the longest serving, if that's the right word, ex-president ever, until Jimmy Carter came along, and Carter has passed him now. Can you talk a bit about what he had I guess he was in his early 50s when he stopped being president, or mid-50s. What did he do with the rest of his life?
Well, after he got booted from office rather unceremoniously in 1932, he more or less went into hiding. He was really hurt to be thrown out, rejected by the American people, and he thought unfairly. He was so damaged by that whole thing that there was one anecdote about him going fishing with a bunch of buddies in Oregon, and they drive into a small town to get some supplies, and they're in this big, black limousine, and so people come out to see, who's in the car, and Hoover ducks down in the back seat because he doesn't want to be seen by people in this town, friendly people.
Who just want to shake his hand and love him.
But he was so embarrassed, so traumatized by his loss that he really wasn't hiding. It wasn't until Roosevelt died and Truman became president that Hoover's rehabilitation started. And Truman put Hoover to work after the Second World War in Europe, trying to right the economy in Europe and get people fed and get things working again, not just in Europe, but around the world. And that was one of Hoover's specialties, was disaster relief. So he did a great job on that. And then he did some later work for Truman in reordering the federal government and the administrative branches after the war, and then he did the same chore for Eisenhower. So in total, Hoover ended up working for 5 presidents, from Woodrow Wilson through Coolidge and Harding to Eisenhower, and he could have worked for Kennedy too. Kennedy wanted him to be head of the Peace Corps, but by then he was in his 80s. Decided it was time to finally retire.
Let's hit on a couple of more things before our time gets away from us here, and that is, we talked about the kind of progressive conservative he was at the beginning of his political career, but he really, I don't know if the right word is morphed, but he certainly became a small government, small C conservative, semi-isolationist, red-hating, communist, fearing type of person later in life. What kind of conservative would you describe him having become?
I think he was mainstream Republican by his 70s and 80s, and we're talking about Republicans in the Cold War era. Yes, they were all anti-communist. They believed that the government had been expanded far too much through the New Deal and through the Second World War, and they wanted to see it cut down to size. So that was the kind of conservative he was then.
Let me make a parallel here, and you tell me if this is nuts.
Okay.
Okay. Some years ago, a Hoover scholar said that the equivalent of Hoover's election back then, today, successful businessman, high profile, international reputation, and so on, would have been, say, Bill Gates becoming president today. Rich guy, philanthropist, humanitarian, and so on. Instead, America just voted for an internationally known, rich businessman who claims to be a philanthropist as well. Not sure about that. Are there any parallels between Hoover and Trump?
There are. They're the only 2 tycoons that have ever made it to the White House, as far as I can tell. And they actually brought that executive mindset, the guy who's run his own business and used to giving orders rather than taking orders and being sort of the singular head of his operations. That executive mindset came with both Hoover and with Trump, and both of them very inexperienced in politics as well, never had elected office before getting to the White House. And I think you see the effects quite clearly in both of them. With Hoover couldn't work with Congress his first 2 years. He wanted to bypass Congress all the time. He hated politics, hated all the glad-handing, compromising, deal-making, wanted to get right to the correct answer rather than the political answer. So he was always getting expert commissions into Washington to try and make decisions about policy and leaving Congress over to the side, and it didn't work. You can't do anything without Congress in Washington. That's the nature of the government there. Trump tried to do the same thing. He didn't have good relations, still doesn't have good relations with Congress, hasn't got much done in his first year, and he tries to bypass Congress all the time through tweets and executive orders and his rallies, his endless rallies that he goes to. And sooner or later, if he wants to get something done, he's going to have to learn, as Hoover did, that you got to work with Congress, you got to do the deal making, you got to invest time in the relationships, you got to be a politician.
Or you might be a one-term president.
Yes.
Let me do one last smart aleck question here, which is your take on Roosevelt in this book is, I guess in order to tell a more generous story about Hoover, you have to necessarily be a little less generous to FDR, and I think you are. You used to work for a guy named Conrad Black, who wrote a similarly thick book about Franklin Roosevelt and credits him with basically saving capitalism. Mm-hmm. So whose take on FDR is, do you think, more on the spot, yours or Black's?
Let me tell you the one thing we agree on, and that's that Roosevelt was an absolute genius as a politician, that he was not ideological, he was not consistent. He knew, though, where his people, his electorate was at, and he never broke faith with those people, and in that regard, he was truly brilliant. I think that the jury's still out on a lot of Roosevelt's domestic reforms and things that he did to business in the U.S. and government in the U.S. I think that the bills are still coming in, and I don't see that there was quite the urgency for some of the radical things that he did, Roosevelt did when he was in office, that Roosevelt claimed there was an urgency about. But, you know, I'm sure Conrad differs with some aspects of my interpretation of Hoover and Hoover's career. So, you know, that's what makes history interesting.
Indeed it does. Sit tight, because we're going to have a few colleagues join us and continue the discussion about politics today. The book is Hoover, An Extraordinary Life in Extraordinary Times. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.